Hello everyone. Before we start, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. That way, you'll never miss another terrifying story. Now let's begin. Winter doesn't just bring cold. Sometimes, it brings things that should have stayed buried in the dark. February 2023 put me in a situation I never thought I'd face. I'm Sarah, 29 years old, and I work night security at a storage facility outside Duluth, Minnesota. The job was supposed to be easy. Watch cameras, do rounds every 2 hours, go home at sunrise. Most nights, nothing happened except maybe a raccoon setting off a motion sensor. That particular Wednesday started normal enough. Temperature sitting at -12 degrees, wind chill making it feel closer to -30. My shift began at 10 p.m., and the facility manager, an older guy named Rick, gave me the usual rundown before heading out. Lock the front gate at 11, keep the office heated, call if anything weird happens. He mentioned the cameras on the north side had been glitchy lately, but maintenance would fix them next week. By midnight, I was halfway through my third cup of coffee, watching security footage on 6 different screens. The facility had about 200 units spread across 4 buildings, and most of our customers only showed up during daytime hours. At night, the place was a ghost town. Rows of orange doors under flickering lights, snow piling up in the corners, nothing moving except the occasional gust of wind. Around 12:30 a.m., the phone rang. Our office line barely ever got calls during my shift, maybe once a month from a customer who forgot their gate code. I picked it up expecting exactly that. Instead, I heard breathing. Heavy, wet breathing like someone had just finished running through deep snow. No words, no background noise, just that labored inhaling and exhaling. "Hello," I said, trying to sound professional despite the immediate unease crawling up my spine. "This is Northwood Storage. How can I help you?" The breathing continued for another 5 seconds, then stopped abruptly. The line went dead. I hung up slowly, telling myself it was probably a prank call or a misdial. Kids sometimes got bored in small towns and pulled stupid stunts. I went back to the monitors, scanning each camera feed more carefully now, looking for anything out of place. Everything looked normal. Empty corridors between units, untouched snow, locked gates. I was about to relax when I noticed something on camera 3, the one covering the east entrance to Building 2. There were footprints in the snow, fresh footprints leading from the fence line toward the building. My heart rate picked up because I knew for certain those prints hadn't been there an hour ago when I did my last round. The gate was locked, the fence was 8 feet tall with barbed wire on top, and no cars had entered the property since Rick left. Someone had climbed over. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, considered calling the police, but decided to check it out first. Sometimes homeless people tried to find shelter in our facilities during brutal cold snaps, and I didn't want to get someone arrested for just trying to survive. I'd rather warn them off and let them go. The walk from the office to Building 2 took about 3 minutes. The wind had picked up, throwing snow in my face so hard I had to squint. My boots crunched through ice with every step, the sound echoing off the metal buildings. When I reached the east entrance, I aimed my flashlight at the ground. The footprints were definitely fresh. Deep impressions in the snow, someone wearing large boots, probably a man based on the size. They led directly to Unit 47, stopping right at the door. The lock was still in place, undamaged, but something felt wrong. The footprints didn't lead away. They just stopped there like whoever made them had vanished. I radioed back to the office out of habit, even though no one else was there. "This is Sarah, checking Building 2 East Side. Found unauthorized footprints, investigating." My voice sounded small against the wind. I walked closer to Unit 47, my flashlight beam bouncing off the orange door. Everything looked secure. No signs of forced entry, no scratches around the lock. I was about to turn back when I heard it. Scratching. Slow, deliberate scratching coming from inside the unit. My entire body went rigid. Storage units were supposed to be empty of people, just belongings. The scratching continued, a rhythmic scraping sound like fingernails dragging across metal from the inside. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking slightly. "This is security. If someone's in there, you need to come out now." The scratching stopped immediately. Silence pressed in around me, broken only by the wind. Then, from inside the unit, I heard that breathing again. The same heavy, wet breathing from the phone call. I backed away from the door, my hand fumbling for my phone to call 911. Before I could pull it from my pocket, the phone in my other hand, the radio crackled to life. But it wasn't supposed to do that. Radios don't receive phone calls. Through the static, I heard a voice, distorted, barely human, dragging out words like they were being pulled through frozen mud. "Let me out." I dropped the radio. It hit the snow with a muffled thump, still crackling with that horrible voice. The scratching inside Unit 47 erupted into violent pounding, the metal door shaking in its frame with each impact. Boom, boom, boom. I ran. Pure instinct took over and I sprinted back toward the office, slipping on ice, nearly falling twice. Behind me, the pounding grew louder, more frantic, like whatever was inside that unit was throwing its entire body against the door. When I reached the office, I slammed the door shut and locked it, pressing my back against the wall and gasping for air. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. The operator answered and I tried to explain what was happening, but my words came out jumbled and panicked. She told me officers were on the way, to stay inside and keep the doors locked. I kept my eyes on the security monitors, watching camera 3, waiting to see if anyone emerged from building 2. Nothing appeared. The pounding had stopped. The snow continued falling, peaceful and quiet, covering those footprints slowly like the earth was trying to hide evidence of something it didn't want to remember. Police arrived about 15 minutes later, 2 officers with flashlights and a no-nonsense attitude. I met them at the gate and explained everything while trying not to sound insane. They exchanged a look that I couldn't quite read, then asked me to show them Unit 47. We walked there together, the 3 of us, and the whole way I kept expecting something to jump out. But the facility remained still and silent. When we reached the unit, there were no footprints anymore. The wind and fresh snow had erased them completely. One officer examined the lock while the other called for the customer's contact information. They wanted to open the unit and check inside. I gave them the details, and we waited another 20 minutes for the customer to call back and authorize entry. When the door finally rolled up, my flashlight beam swept across the interior. Empty. Completely empty except for dust and a few dead moths in the corner. No person. No scratches on the metal walls. No explanation for the sounds I'd heard. The officers searched thoroughly, checking every inch of the 10 by 10 space. One of them noticed my expression and said that sound could do weird things in winter, bouncing off buildings and traveling in unexpected ways. Maybe I'd heard something from outside the fence, someone messing around in the woods. But that didn't explain the phone call. It didn't explain the breathing on my radio. And it definitely didn't explain the footprints that led to that unit and nowhere else. The police filed a report and told me to call immediately if anything else happened. After they left, I sat in the office for the rest of my shift, watching those monitors like my life depended on it. Every shadow looked suspicious. Every movement on screen made my heart jump. Around 4 a.m., the office phone rang again. I stared at it for 5 full rings before forcing myself to answer. "Northwood Storage," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. Heavy breathing filled the line. The same breathing from before. Then, underneath it, I heard something else. Scraping. Metal scraping against metal, rhythmic and patient. A voice cut through the noise, clearer this time, no longer distorted. Still here. I slammed the phone down and didn't answer it again for the rest of the night. When Rick came in at 6 a.m. to start his day shift, I was packed and ready to leave before he'd even taken off his coat. I told him I quit, effective immediately, and that he could mail my final check. He asked what happened, concern written all over his face, but I couldn't find the words to explain. How do you tell someone that something called you from inside an empty storage unit? That it knew you were there, knew you could hear it, and wanted you to know it was still waiting? I never went back to that facility. A few weeks later, I heard from a friend who worked at the diner in town that they'd found something during a routine inspection. Unit 47 had been rented under a false name 6 months earlier, paid in cash for a full year. When they finally got a warrant to open it for investigation, they found scratches on the inside of the door. Deep gouges in the metal, like someone had been trapped in there, clawing to get out. But according to the rental logs, no one had accessed that unit since the day it was rented. The lock had never been opened. Whatever made those marks did it while the door was sealed shut. I still get calls sometimes. Always at night, always during winter. My phone will ring from a blocked number, and when I'm stupid enough to answer, I hear that breathing. That patient, wet breathing that sounds like it's waiting for something. Waiting for me to let it out. Story 2. The Ice Fisher's Shadow. March 2022 dropped me into the worst 36 hours of my life, and I still wake up some nights drenched in sweat, seeing that shadow move under the ice. I'm Marcus, 31 years old, and I've been ice fishing on Lake Champlain since my dad first took me out when I was 9. By the time this happened, I thought I knew every danger that frozen water could throw at me. Pressure cracks, thin ice, hypothermia. I dealt with it all. But I'd never dealt with something that watched from below. That weekend started with perfect conditions. Clear sky, 18 degrees. Ice reported at 14 inches thick across most of the lake. My buddy Trevor and I planned a full weekend trip, setting up our shanty about half a mile from shore in an area known for good perch fishing. We loaded up Trevor's truck Friday afternoon with gear, propane heaters, enough food for 3 days, and a case of beer we probably didn't need but brought anyway. The drive up from Burlington took about 40 minutes, and we spent most of it talking about work and complaining about our girlfriends. Normal guy stuff. By the time we pulled into the access point, the sun was already starting to drop, painting the snow orange and gold. A few other trucks sat in the lot, other fishermen heading out for the weekend, and we nodded to them as we hauled our gear across the frozen expanse. Trevor had a GPS unit that marked our usual spot, and we followed it out into the growing darkness, our headlamps cutting white beams through the cold air. The ice beneath our boots was solid, making those deep booming sounds it makes when it's thick and safe. We'd done this trip maybe 20 times before, so neither of us felt any nervousness. We set up the shanty, drilled 4 holes with the auger, and had our lines in the water by 7 p.m. The heater hummed quietly in the corner, filling the small space with warmth, and for the first few hours, everything was exactly like it should be. We caught a few perch, drank some beers, talked about the Bruins game we'd missed the night before. Around 10 p.m., Trevor's line jerked hard. Not the subtle nibble of a perch, but a violent pull that nearly yanked the rod out of his hand. He grabbed it with both hands, setting the hook, and started reeling. Whatever he'd caught was heavy and fighting hard, pulling line out against the drag. "This is a big one," he grunted, bracing his boots against the ice. "Could be a pike." I grabbed the net and moved closer to the hole, watching the dark water. Trevor reeled steadily, gaining line inch by inch. The fight went on for maybe 2 minutes, both of us focused on that hole, waiting to see what would surface. Then the line went slack. Not broken, just suddenly weightless, like whatever had been on the other end simply let go. Trevor reeled in the empty line, checking the hook. It was bent at a weird angle, nearly straightened out, like something with incredible strength had pulled it. His lure was gone completely. "What the hell can bend a hook like that?" he muttered, examining it under his headlamp. I had no answer. We re-rigged his line and went back to fishing. But something felt different now. The comfortable atmosphere we'd built had shifted slightly, replaced by an awareness that we weren't alone out here. Other fish, other things, lived in the dark water below us. About an hour later, I was dozing in my chair when Trevor shook my shoulder. "Marcus, look at this." I opened my eyes and followed his gaze to the ice hole nearest to him. The water inside was perfectly still, which was normal, but there was something underneath it. A shadow, large and dark, hovering maybe 3 feet below the surface. We both leaned closer, trying to make out details. Fish will sometimes hang around ice fishing holes, attracted by the light or the vibrations, so seeing a shadow wasn't unusual. But this one was too big. Way too big. "That's gotta be a pike," Trevor whispered. "Maybe 40 inches. But as we watched, the shadow moved in a way that made my stomach clench. It shifted sideways, then up, then down, like it was examining the hole from different angles. Pike don't move like that. Nothing I'd ever caught moved like that. The shadow rose closer to the surface, and for just a second, I thought I saw something break through the water. Something pale and thin, not a fin, more like fingers. Long, skeletal fingers that reached up toward the edge of the hole before sinking back down. Trevor jerked backward so hard he knocked over his beer. "Did you see that?" I nodded, unable to speak. We both stared at the hole, but the shadow was gone. The water sat perfectly still again, reflecting the dim light of our lantern. "Maybe it was just a reflection," I said, not believing my own words. The light playing tricks. Trevor didn't respond. He just kept staring at that hole like he expected something to crawl out of it. We decided to call it a night after that, packing up our rods and settling into our sleeping bags. But neither of us actually slept. Every sound outside made us tense. The wind against the shanty walls, the groan of ice shifting, the occasional crack that echoed across the lake like a gunshot. Around 3 a.m., I heard scratching. Soft at first, barely audible, then growing louder. It was coming from directly beneath us, from under the ice. I sat up slowly, reaching for my flashlight. Trevor was already awake, his eyes wide in the darkness. "You hear that?" he whispered. I nodded. The scratching continued, steady and rhythmic, like something was dragging sharp nails across the underside of the ice. Back and forth, right below where we were sleeping. Trevor grabbed his flashlight and aimed it at the nearest ice hole. The beam cut through the water, illuminating maybe 4 feet down. First, we saw nothing. Then the shadow appeared again, rising from the depths, growing larger as it approached the surface. It stopped about a foot below the hole and stayed there, perfectly still. We could see its outline clearly now, and it wasn't a fish. It was too long, too narrow, too deliberately positioned. It looked almost human in shape, but distorted, stretched out like someone had grabbed a person by both ends and pulled. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed felt worse somehow, more oppressive than the sound had been. "We should go," I said quietly. "Pack up and head back to shore." Trevor agreed immediately. We started grabbing our gear, moving as quickly as we could without making too much noise, though I'm not sure why we bothered being quiet. Whatever was down there already knew we were here. As we packed, I kept glancing at the ice hole. The shadow remained motionless, watching us. Or at least that's what it felt like it had eyes we couldn't see, fixed on our every movement. We had everything loaded in about 10 minutes, and Trevor opened the shanty door to the frigid night air. The lake stretched out around us, a vast white expanse broken only by scattered fishing shacks in the distance. Our truck sat half a mile away, visible only by the faint reflection of its chrome bumper catching moonlight. We started walking, pulling our gear on a sled, moving as fast as the ice would allow. About 100 yards from the shanty, Trevor stopped suddenly. "Marcus," he said, his voice tight, "the ice." I looked down and felt my blood freeze colder than the air around us. The ice beneath our feet was clear enough to see through in places, and there was something moving under it. The shadow had followed us. It glided beneath the frozen surface, keeping pace with our steps, its elongated form undulating in a way that made my brain hurt to watch. We could see it clearly now, backlit by moonlight filtering through the ice. It had limbs, or something like limbs, that moved in too many directions at once. "Run," Trevor said. We ran, pulling the sled behind us, boots slipping on the smooth ice, lungs burning from the cold air. The shadow kept pace effortlessly, sometimes pulling ahead, sometimes falling behind, like it was toying with us. My mind raced through everything I knew about Lake Champlain. The deepest parts reached over 400 feet. People had drowned here, disappeared here, been lost to the dark water and never recovered. And something about the way that shadow moved made me think it knew where all those lost people had gone. We were maybe 200 yards from shore when the ice cracked. Not beneath us, but ahead of us, a jagged line splitting across our path. Water seeped up through the crack, dark and oily in the moonlight. The shadow rose to the surface right in the middle of that crack. We could see it clearly now, pressed against the underside of the ice. It was vaguely humanoid but wrong in every proportion. Arms too long, fingers too many, a head that seemed to be mostly jaw. It reached up with one of those terrible hands and pressed against the ice from below. The frozen surface bowed upward slightly under the pressure, creaking and groaning. Trevor pulled out his phone to call for help, but of course there was no signal. We were too far from shore, too isolated. We had nothing except our fear and the growing certainty that if that thing broke through the ice, we were dead. For a long moment, it just stayed there, pressed against the ice barrier between us, its form shifting and writhing in ways that didn't match any creature I'd ever seen or read about. Then, slowly, it sank back down into the darkness and disappeared. The crack in the ice remained, but the immediate threat had passed. We circled around it carefully, giving the gap a wide berth, and continued toward shore at a pace that was just short of sprinting. We made it back to the truck without the shadow reappearing, threw our gear in the bed without bothering to organize it, and drove away from that lake faster than was probably safe on icy roads. Neither of us spoke for the entire drive home. The next day, Trevor called the local fish and game office to report what we'd seen, trying to describe it in a way that didn't make us sound insane. The officer on the phone listened politely, then said that people sometimes saw strange things on the ice at night, that exhaustion and cold could play tricks on your mind. But he also said something else, something that stuck with me. He mentioned that Lake Champlain had a long history of unusual sightings, going back hundreds of years. Native American stories about something that lived in the deep parts, something that wasn't quite fish and wasn't quite anything else they had words for. He didn't say he believed those stories, but he didn't say he didn't believe them either. I never went ice fishing again. Trevor sold all his gear within a month, and we don't talk about that weekend. But sometimes, when I'm near any body of frozen water, I can't help looking down at the ice beneath my feet and wondering what's looking back up at me from below. Wondering if it followed me home somehow, swimming through underground waterways and frozen lakes, searching for the people who saw it that night, the people who know it exists. Last winter, I was walking my dog near a small pond that freezes over in my neighborhood. The ice looked solid, untouched by anyone since the last snow. But right in the center, I saw a shadow, long and thin and impossibly dark against the white surface. My dog whined and pulled me away, refusing to go any closer. And I was grateful for that because some part of me wanted to walk out onto that ice, wanted to look down through the frozen surface and see if it was really there, wanted to know if it still remembered me. Story 3: The Cabin Guest. January 2021 should have been my reset. After a brutal breakup and losing my job in the same week, I needed to get away from everything. My uncle owned a small cabin in northern Montana, and he offered it to me for as long as I wanted. No rent, no strings, just solitude and time to figure out my next move. I'm Rachel, 27 years old, and at that point in my life, isolation sounded perfect. The cabin sat 12 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a narrow gravel road that became completely impassable once snow got deep enough. My uncle warned me about that, said I'd need to stock up on supplies before any big storm, but I'd lived in Colorado for 3 years and thought I knew how to handle mountain winters. I moved in during the first week of January, right after New Year's. The cabin was small but well-maintained. 1 bedroom, a main room with a wood stove, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom with a shower that worked most of the time. No Wi-Fi, no cell service. Just me and the woods and the sound of wind through pine trees. The first week was exactly what I needed. I slept late, read books I'd been meaning to finish for years, took long walks through the snow when the weather permitted. I started feeling human again, started thinking maybe I could actually rebuild my life once winter ended. The second week, things started feeling different. Small things at first, easy to dismiss. I'd wake up and find the wood stove burning stronger than it should have been after 8 hours. I'd remember leaving 3 logs in before bed, but by morning there would be 2 left and the stove would be warm, like someone had been feeding it during the night. I told myself I was just forgetting things, that my sleep-deprived brain wasn't tracking details correctly. But then I started noticing other stuff. Food missing from the pantry. Not full meals, just small amounts. A can of soup here, some crackers there. Enough that I noticed, but not enough to be sure I wasn't just eating more than I remembered. The footprints appeared on day 10. I woke up to fresh snow, maybe 4 inches of it, covering everything in that perfect white blanket that makes the world look new. I went outside to bring in more firewood from the stack against the cabin's north wall, and that's when I saw them. Boot prints in the snow, circling the cabin. They started at the tree line about 50 yards out, approached to within 10 feet of the walls, then retreated back into the forest. They were fresh, made after the snow had stopped falling around 3 a.m. based on how crisp the edges looked. My first thought was that my uncle had come to check on me without mentioning it, but the prints were too small to be his. My second thought was maybe a hiker had gotten lost and was looking for shelter, but that didn't explain why they'd circled the cabin and left without knocking. I followed the tracks into the tree line, but they disappeared after about 100 yards where the canopy was too thick for snow to accumulate. I stood there for a while, listening to the silence, feeling watched even though I couldn't see anyone. That night, I locked both doors and wedged a chair under the handle of the front one. I kept the wood stove burning and sat up reading until almost midnight, jumping at every sound the cabin made. Old buildings settle and creak, especially in cold weather, but every noise felt loaded with meaning now. Every groan of wood could be a footstep. Every scrape could be someone testing the windows. Around 2 a.m., I finally fell asleep in the chair by the stove. When I woke up 3 hours later, someone had draped a blanket over me. I didn't own that blanket. I'd never seen it before in my life. It was old wool, smelling faintly of mildew and smoke, and it had been carefully tucked around my shoulders while I slept, like someone had been trying to keep me warm. I threw the blanket across the room and checked both doors. still locked from the inside. Both windows were sealed shut, frozen in their frames like they'd been for weeks. There was no way anyone had gotten in, but someone had. Someone had been inside the cabin while I slept, close enough to touch me, and I'd never woken up. I grabbed my car keys, ready to drive into town and call my uncle from the one payphone outside the general store. But when I opened the door, I found my car buried under 3 feet of snow. A storm had blown in during the night, one I'd somehow slept through, and the road out was completely blocked. I was trapped, at least for the next few days, until the snow melted enough for my car to push through or until a plow came out this far, which my uncle had mentioned only happened about once a week during heavy winter. I spent that day trying to rationalize everything. Maybe the blanket had been in the cabin all along and I just never noticed it. Maybe I'd put it on myself in a half-asleep state and forgotten. Maybe the missing food was just poor inventory on my part. Maybe the footprints were from before I'd even arrived, and I was seeing patterns that didn't exist. But the wood stove, that was harder to explain. I'd specifically put in 3 logs before falling asleep. When I woke up with the blanket, there were 5 logs in the stove, all burning steadily. Someone had been feeding the fire while I slept. Someone had wanted to make sure I stayed warm. That realization didn't comfort me. It should have. Maybe the idea that whoever was doing this seemed to be trying to help rather than harm. But something about it felt predatory, like a cat bringing a dead mouse to its owner. A gesture that mimics care but comes from something that doesn't understand what care actually means. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the bedroom with the door locked, a kitchen knife in my lap, listening to every sound. The cabin was never fully silent. The stove crackled, the walls contracted in the cold, the roof shed snow in heavy thumps. But underneath those normal sounds, I started hearing new ones. Footsteps, slow, careful footsteps in the main room. The creak of floorboards under weight, moving from the front door toward the kitchen, then toward the bedroom where I sat frozen with fear. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I could see the shadow of feet blocking the light that came under the gap at the bottom. For a long moment, nothing happened. We both just waited, me and whatever stood on the other side of that thin piece of wood. Then a voice, quiet, raspy, like someone who hadn't spoken in years. "Are you cold?" I didn't answer, couldn't answer. My throat had closed up completely. The voice continued, patient and strange. "The fire is getting low. I should add more wood." I heard those footsteps retreat, moving back toward the main room. Then the sound of the stove door opening, wood being placed inside, the door closing again. All the normal sounds of someone tending a fire. I waited until I couldn't hear anything except my own heartbeat. Then slowly, quietly, I pushed a dresser in front of the bedroom door. It wouldn't stop anyone determined to get in, but it might slow them down, might give me a few seconds to react. The rest of the night passed in terrified silence. I watched the sun come up through the bedroom window, the light turning the snow outside from blue to gold, and I'd never been more grateful to see morning. When I finally opened the bedroom door, pushing the dresser aside, I found the main room empty. But the wood stove was fully loaded with fresh logs, and a pot of something sat on top of it, warming. I approached it carefully and looked inside. Soup. Someone had made soup while I'd hidden in the bedroom. It smelled good, actually, like vegetables and herbs, and steam rose from it in gentle curls. On the small table next to the stove, someone had laid out a bowl and spoon, like they were inviting me to eat. Next to the bowl sat a note, written in shaky handwriting on a torn piece of paper bag. "You haven't been eating enough. You need to stay strong." I didn't touch the soup. I backed away from it slowly, grabbed my coat, and forced my way out the front door into snow that immediately came up to my thighs. I didn't care. I waded through it toward where my car sat buried, digging at the snow with my bare hands, trying to clear enough to get the door open. Behind me, I heard the cabin door open. I turned and saw a figure standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the light from inside. Thin, impossibly thin, wearing clothes that looked decades old. Their face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel them watching me. "The storm isn't over," the figure said in that same raspy voice. "You'll freeze out there." They were probably right. The temperature was well below zero, the wind was picking up again, and I was already losing feeling in my fingers. But the terror overrode every survival instinct I had. "What do you want?" I screamed at them, my voice cracking. The figure tilted their heads slowly, like they were confused by the question. "I'm taking care of you. You seemed so sad when you arrived. So tired. I thought you needed someone to help." "I don't want your help," I said, turning back to my car and digging more frantically. "Leave me alone." "But you'll die out here without help," they said, their voice carrying easily across the snow despite the wind. "That's what happened to me. I died out here alone. I don't want that to happen to you." I froze, my hands buried in snow, and turned to look at them again. They stepped forward slightly, and the morning light caught their face for the first time. They looked like they'd been dead for years. Skin gray and tight across bones, eyes sunken deep in their skull, lips pulled back in something between a smile and a grimace. But they were moving, talking, standing in the doorway like this was the most natural thing in the world. "This was my cabin," they continued, gesturing behind them. 40 years ago. I came here to get away from everything, just like you. But I got snowed in and my food ran out and no one came to check on me. By the time spring arrived and someone found me, I'd been dead for months. My hands had stopped digging. I couldn't move, couldn't think beyond the pure horror of what I was seeing. "But I never left," they said, stepping out into the snow. They didn't sink into it the way I did. They barely left footprints, like they weighed nothing. "I've been here ever since, waiting. And then you came, and you were so sad, and I thought maybe I could help someone this time. Maybe I could keep someone alive." They were closer now, maybe 20 feet away, close enough that I could see the ice crystals frozen to their clothes, could see the way their breath didn't fog in the cold air because they weren't really breathing. "I don't need your help," I whispered, finding my voice again. "I don't want to stay here." They stopped moving, their expression shifting to something that looked like disappointment. "But if you leave, I'll be alone again. I've been alone for so long." "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it despite the terror. "But I can't stay." The figure stood there for a long moment, snow beginning to settle on their shoulders and head. Then slowly they nodded. "I understand. Everyone leaves eventually." They turned and walked back into the cabin, and I heard the door close softly behind them. I went back to digging out my car with renewed energy, fueled by fear and adrenaline. It took almost 2 hours, but I finally cleared enough snow to get inside and start the engine. The drive out was treacherous, my car sliding on ice and getting stuck twice, but I made it to the main road by early afternoon. I drove straight to my uncle's house 3 hours away and told him everything. He listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious as I talked. When I finished, he sighed and said that the cabin did have a history. A person had died there back in the 1980s, a woman who'd been staying there during a harsh winter. She'd frozen to death, and her body wasn't found until spring. My uncle said he'd always felt uncomfortable in that cabin, that something about it never felt quite empty even when no one was there. But he'd convinced himself it was just the age of the place, the usual creepiness of old buildings. He'd never told me because he thought I'd think he was being superstitious. I never went back to that cabin. My uncle ended up selling the property that summer to someone who wanted to tear it down and build something new. I heard later that when they demolished the old structure, they found things hidden in the walls. canned food, blankets, supplies that had been carefully stored away, like someone had been preparing for a long winter that never ended. Sometimes I think about that figure, about the loneliness in their voice when they said everyone leaves eventually, about how they'd spent 40 years in that cabin, trapped by whatever force keeps some dead people anchored to the places where they died. Part of me feels guilty for leaving them there alone, but a bigger part of me knows I made the right choice, because whatever they were offering, whatever kind of care they thought they were providing, it wasn't meant for the living. It was the care you give to something you're trying to preserve, something you want to keep with you forever. Story 4. The Highway Hitchhiker. December 2020 put me on a stretch of highway I'd driven 100 times before, but something about that night made it feel different. I'm Kevin, 33, and I work in medical equipment sales, which means I spend a lot of time on the road between small-town hospitals. This particular drive was from Billings, Montana to Rapid City, South Dakota, a route that cuts through some of the loneliest country you'll ever see. I left Billings around 6 p.m., later than I'd planned because a client meeting ran long. The weather forecast mentioned possible snow, but nothing severe, and I figured I could beat it. My car had good tires, I had emergency supplies in the trunk, and I'd made this drive in worse conditions. The first hour was fine. Light traffic, clear roads, the kind of boring drive where you put on a podcast and zone out. But as I got farther from Billings, the sky took on that heavy gray color that promises snow, and the temperature gauge on my dashboard dropped from 28 degrees to 19. By the time I crossed into Wyoming, snow had started falling. Not the pretty, light kind that looks festive. The heavy, wind-driven kind that cuts visibility down to almost nothing. I slowed to 40 miles per hour, then 30, my headlights barely penetrating the white curtain in front of me. The highway was empty. No other cars in either direction, which wasn't unusual for this route in bad weather. Most people had the sense to wait out the storm rather than risk it. But I had a meeting in Rapid City at 9 a.m. the next morning, and I was stupid enough to think I could push through. Around mile marker 47, my headlights caught something on the shoulder of the road. Person standing completely still, facing the highway. I couldn't see much detail through the snow, just a dark figure with their arm raised, thumb out in the universal symbol for hitchhiking. My first instinct was to keep driving. Every safety lesson I'd ever learned said never pick up hitchhikers, especially alone at night in the middle of nowhere. But the storm was getting worse by the minute, and whoever that person was, they'd freeze to death if they stayed out there much longer. I slowed down and pulled onto the shoulder about 20 feet past them, my hazard lights flashing. In my rearview mirror, I watched the figure approach through the falling snow. They moved slowly, deliberately, not running toward the warmth like most people would. They reached my passenger window and tapped on it gently. I hit the lock button, keeping the doors secured while I sized them up. It was a woman, maybe late 30s or early 40s, wearing a thin jacket that looked completely inadequate for this weather. Her hair was plastered to her head with snow, and her skin had that pale, waxy look people get when they're seriously cold. I cracked the window about 2 inches. "You okay?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Car broke down about 3 miles back. "I've been walking for an hour. Could you give me a ride to the next town?" Everything about the situation felt wrong. Her calm demeanor, the fact that she'd been walking for an hour in this weather without showing any signs of hypothermia, the way she stood perfectly still instead of shivering. But I couldn't just leave her there. "Yeah, okay. Get in." I unlocked the doors and she slid into the passenger seat, bringing a wave of cold air with her. She didn't brush the snow off her jacket or stamp her feet or do any of the things people normally do when coming in from the cold. She just sat there, hands in her lap, staring straight ahead through the windshield. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Not many people stop anymore." I pulled back onto the highway, accelerating carefully on the slick road. "You should probably turn the heat up. You must be freezing." She didn't respond, didn't reach for the heat controls, just kept staring ahead with that same blank expression. I tried to make conversation, asking where she was headed, what had happened to her car, the usual small talk you make with strangers. She answered in short, vague sentences that didn't really provide any information. Her car had just stopped working. She was trying to get to somewhere safe. She'd been on the road for a while. After about 10 minutes of this stilted conversation, I noticed something that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. She wasn't leaving any condensation on the window next to her. I was breathing hard enough that my side of the windshield kept fogging up, requiring me to blast the defroster. But her side stayed completely clear, like she wasn't breathing at all. I glanced at her from the corner of my eye. Her chest wasn't moving. No rise and fall, no visible breath in the cold air between us. "So," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "how long have you been out here?" She turned to look at me for the first time since getting in the car. Her eyes were gray, flat, like looking at a frozen lake. "A long time," she said. The temperature in the car had dropped despite the heater running full blast. I could see my breath now, thick white clouds that disappeared almost immediately. "Where exactly do you need to go?" I asked. She smiled again, and this time I saw that her teeth were wrong. Too many of them packed too tightly together. "I told you, somewhere safe." My foot eased off the gas pedal involuntarily. The car slowed from 35 to 25, and the silence between us grew heavier. "The thing about this highway," she said, her voice taking on a distant quality, "is that it's hungry, has been for years. So many accidents, so many people who never made it to their destinations. The road remembers all of them." I wanted to tell her to stop talking, wanted to pull over and make her get out, but something kept me frozen in place. "I had a daughter once," she continued, staring out at the storm. "She was 6 years old. We were driving to her grandmother's house for Christmas, and it was snowing just like this. A truck crossed the center line and hit us head-on. The police said we died instantly, but that's not quite true." My blood went cold. "What are you talking about?" She turned to face me fully now, and in the dim light from the dashboard, I could see that she was wrong all over. Her skin had a grayish tint, her movements were too fluid, and there was something off about her proportions, like looking at a photograph that had been stretched. "I'm talking about the space between," she said. "The place where people end up when they die on lonely roads in winter storms. We're not quite gone, but we're not quite here either. And we get so lonely." I slammed on the brakes, sending the car into a skid. It spun 180 degrees before coming to a stop facing the wrong direction on the highway. My heart hammered against my ribs as I reached across to unlock her door. "Get out," I said, my voice shaking. "Get out of my car right now." She didn't move, just sat there with that terrible smile, her too many teeth catching the light. "You can't make me leave," she said softly. "I've been waiting for someone like you, someone alone, someone who would stop." She reached out with one hand, and I saw that her fingers were too long, the joints bending in places they shouldn't. She touched my shoulder, and where her hand made contact, I felt a cold so intense it burned. "You're going to stay with me," she whispered. "We're going to have so much time together." Something in me snapped. I shoved her hand away and threw myself out of the driver's side door, stumbling into the snow. The cold hit me like a physical blow, but adrenaline kept me moving. I ran toward the back of the car, slipping on ice, my boots finding no purchase. Behind me, I heard the passenger door open, heard footsteps crunching through snow, too light, too rhythmic. I reached into my pocket for my phone, thinking I could call 911, could get help somehow. But when I pulled it out, the screen was black. Not dead, but showing a reflection. My reflection. And behind me in the phone's dark surface, I saw her approaching, her body moving in ways that defied normal movement. The highway stretched empty in both directions. No lights, no help, just snow and darkness and whatever she had become. I ran. No destination, no plan, just pure survival instinct driving me forward along the shoulder of the road. My breath came in ragged gasps, each inhale burning my lungs with freezing air. She didn't chase me. When I finally looked back, she was standing next to my car, one hand resting on the roof, watching me with an expression that might have been sadness or hunger or something between the two. Then headlights appeared from the direction I'd been traveling. A semi-truck, moving slowly through the storm, its engine rumbling loud enough to feel in my chest. I stumbled into the middle of the highway, waving my arms, screaming for the truck to stop. The driver hit the brakes, the massive vehicle sliding slightly before coming to a halt about 30 feet from me. The driver, a man in his 50s with a graying beard, rolled down his window. "What the hell are you doing? You trying to get killed?" I pointed back at my car, where she was still standing. "That woman, she's not." But when I looked, she was gone. The passenger door hung open, snow already accumulating on the seat where she'd sat. No footprints leading away, no sign she'd ever been there at all. The truck driver climbed down from his cab and approached me carefully, like I might be dangerous. "You okay, buddy? You look like you've seen a ghost." I tried to explain, words tumbling out in a confused rush, but even to my own ears it sounded insane. A woman who didn't breathe, who said she died on this highway, who tried to make me stay with her. The driver listened patiently, then walked over to my car and checked inside. He came back shaking his head. "Nobody in there now. You sure you didn't fall asleep at the wheel? Maybe dreamed it." I wanted to believe that, wanted to write it off as exhaustion or stress or anything normal. But I could still feel where her hand had touched my shoulder, a cold spot that wouldn't warm up no matter how many layers I put on. The driver offered to follow me to the next town, make sure I got there safely. I accepted gratefully, got back in my car, and drove with his headlights filling my rearview mirror the entire way. I never saw her again, but I think about her constantly, about the loneliness in her voice when she talked about the space between, about all the other people who might have died on that highway, trapped in whatever liminal place she existed in. I don't drive that route anymore. I'll add 3 hours to my trips to avoid it, because sometimes late at night, when I'm alone in my car, I'll see something in the passenger seat from the corner of my eye. A shadow, a suggestion of movement, and I have to resist the urge to look directly at it because I'm terrified of what I might see sitting next to me, waiting patiently for another chance to make me stay. Story 5. The Neighbor's House. Living alone in the suburbs felt like a victory after years of cramped apartments and difficult roommates. I'm Tom, 35, working as a software developer. And in early 2023, I finally saved enough to buy a small house in a quiet neighborhood outside Denver. The place needed work, but it was mine, and that mattered more than the dated kitchen or the weird brown carpet in the living room. My house sat on a corner lot with a tidy lawn and a 2-car garage I'd never fill. To my right lived the Hendersons, a retired couple who spent most afternoons gardening and waved whenever I pulled into the driveway. To my left sat an empty house, or at least I thought it was empty at first. The place looked abandoned. Peeling paint, overgrown yard, windows so dirty you couldn't see through them. The for sale sign in the front yard had faded to the point where the phone number was barely legible. I asked Mrs. Henderson about it during one of those polite fence conversations neighbors have. She frowned when I mentioned the house. "That place has been empty for 3 years. Owner died, and I guess the family doesn't care enough to sell it properly. We've called the city about the yard, but nothing ever happens. That should have been the end of it. Just another neglected property waiting for someone to either buy it or condemn it. But 2 weeks after moving in, I noticed lights. Not bright lights, but faint flickering glows visible through the grimy windows late at night. At first I thought maybe the electrical system was shorting out, creating random sparks. But the lights moved, passing from room to room like someone carrying a candle. I mentioned it to Henderson, and his expression darkened. "You see those lights too? We thought we were imagining things. Been happening on and off for about 6 months now." "Have you called the police?" I asked. He shook his head. "Twice. They came out both times, checked the property, said there were no signs of forced entry and no one inside. Told us it was probably just car headlights reflecting off the windows at odd angles." That explanation didn't sit right with me. The angle was wrong, and car headlights didn't explain the way those lights moved with deliberate purpose through the rooms. I decided to investigate myself. Not break in, just look around the property during daylight, see if there were any obvious signs of squatters or damage. The next Saturday morning, I walked over with my phone ready to call 911 if anything seemed dangerous. The front door was locked, handle crusted with rust. I cupped my hands around my eyes and pressed my face to the door's small window. The interior was dark, but I could make out shapes. Furniture covered in sheets, walls that looked water-damaged, a staircase leading up to the second floor. Nothing obviously wrong, nothing that suggested anyone was living there. But the air around the house felt heavy, oppressive in a way I couldn't quite articulate, like the building itself was watching me examine it. I walked around to the back, where a chain-link fence separated the yard from an alley. The back door hung slightly ajar. The wood around the lock splintered like someone had forced it open. My heart rate picked up as I pushed the gate and stepped into the overgrown backyard. The open door swayed gently in the breeze, creaking on rusty hinges. Common sense said to call the police and let them handle it. Curiosity, and maybe a little arrogance about being able to take care of my own neighborhood, pushed me forward. I stepped into the kitchen. Immediately the smell hit me. Not decomposition or anything organic, but mildew and rot and something else underneath. Something chemical and wrong that made my eyes water. "Hello!" I called out, my voice sounding small in the empty house. "Anyone here?" No response. The kitchen was a disaster. Cabinets hanging open, dishes piled in the sink growing things that might have once been food. I moved into the living room, stepping carefully around debris, my phone's flashlight cutting through the gloom. The furniture under those sheets looked expensive or had been once. A grandfather clock stood against one wall, stopped at 3:17. Pictures hung crooked on the walls, family photos of people I didn't recognize, all of them smiling in that stiff way people did in older photographs. That's when I heard it. Footsteps above me, slow and deliberate, crossing from one side of the ceiling to the other. I froze, my flashlight beam fixed on the water-stained plaster above my head. The footsteps continued, reaching what I assumed was the staircase, then starting down. Someone was coming down those stairs toward me. Someone who had heard me call out and decided to respond not with words but with approach. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of that house immediately. But I stood there, paralyzed by equal parts fear and morbid curiosity, watching the dark staircase as those footsteps grew closer. A figure emerged from the shadows at the bottom of the stairs. Tall, thin, wearing clothes that looked decades out of style. I couldn't see their face clearly. The light from my phone wasn't strong enough, but I saw their hands. Pale, almost luminous in the darkness, with fingers that seemed too long. "You shouldn't be here," the figure said. their voice dry and raspy like they hadn't used it in years. I took a step backward, bumping into a covered chair. "I'm sorry. I thought the house was empty. I was just checking because you saw the lights," they interrupted. "Everyone sees the lights eventually. The neighbors, people driving past, now you." The figure moved closer and I could make out more details. Their face was gaunt, skin stretched tight over bones, eyes sunken so deep they looked like holes. They moved with an unsettling fluidity, like their joints worked differently than normal human joints. "This is my house," they said simply. "I died here 3 years ago, but I never left, and now people keep trying to make me leave." My back hit the wall, trapping me between the figure and the kitchen doorway that suddenly seemed very far away. "I don't want to make you leave. I just wanted to know." "Know what?" they asked, tilting their head at an angle that made my neck hurt just looking at it. "Know if the stories are true? Know if houses really can be haunted? Know what happens to people who don't move on?" They reached out with one of those 2 long hands, fingers stretching toward my face. I ducked sideways and ran, not caring about dignity or explanation, just pure animal panic driving me toward the door. I made it to the kitchen before something grabbed my ankle. I went down hard, my phone skittering across the filthy linoleum and leaving me in darkness. Hands, impossibly cold hands, gripped my leg and pulled me backward across the floor. I kicked out blindly, connecting with something that felt solid 1 second and insubstantial the next. The grip loosened just enough for me to scramble free and lunge for my phone. My fingers closed around it and I swung the light back toward whatever had grabbed me. Nothing. The kitchen was empty except for the rot and the ruin and my own ragged breathing. I ran out the back door and didn't stop until I was in my own house with every door locked and every light turned on. My ankle throbbed where those hands had gripped me, and when I pulled up my pant leg to check, I found marks. Not bruises, but frost burns, perfect handprints of damaged skin where something impossibly cold had touched me. I called the police that night and told them someone was living in the abandoned house next door. Someone dangerous. They came out again, checked the property again, and found nothing. No evidence of habitation, no signs of struggle, no explanation for my injuries except that I must have hurt myself while trespassing. The officer who took my statement suggested I stay away from the property in the future, for my own safety and legal protection. I agreed wholeheartedly, but the lights continued. Every few nights, I'd see them moving through those dark windows. And once, just once, I saw a figure standing in the upstairs window looking directly at my house. Looking at me. I called a real estate agent the next day and put my house on the market. Took a loss selling it so quickly, but I didn't care. Some people might be brave enough to live next to something like that, to pretend it's just their imagination or tricks of light. I'm not one of those people. Not after feeling those cold hands pull me across that floor. Not after seeing something that should be dead standing at the bottom of those stairs. The house sold within a month to a young couple who seemed excited about the neighborhood. I didn't mention the house next door. Maybe they'll be fine. Maybe whatever's in there only bothers certain people, leaves others alone. But sometimes I check that street on Google Maps, using Street View to see if anything has changed. The house is still there, still looking abandoned. And if you zoom in on the second-floor window, if you look very carefully at the dark glass, you can see a pale shape that might be a reflection. Or might be something standing there, waiting patiently for the next person curious enough to investigate. Story 6. The Service Station. Night shifts at the rural service station weren't supposed to be eventful. That's what drew me to the job in the first place. I'm Lisa, 28, putting myself through graduate school by working overnight at a tiny gas station 30 miles outside Boise. The place sat at a crossroads between 2 highways, catching travelers who miscalculated their fuel or needed coffee at 2 a.m. Most nights I read textbooks between customers, maybe saw a dozen people total in an 8-hour shift. The isolation was perfect for studying. No chatty coworkers, no demanding boss hovering nearby. Just me and the hum of refrigerators and the occasional ping when someone pulled up to the pumps. February brought a cold snap that kept most people off the roads after dark. Temperatures dropped into the single digits, and the forecast kept warning about black ice making the highways treacherous. My shift that night started at 11 p.m., and by midnight I'd only had one customer, a tired trucker who grabbed coffee and a sandwich without making conversation. The station had 6 pumps outside and a small convenience store attached. Standard setup, fluorescent lights that buzzed constantly, aisles of snacks and motor oil, a bathroom that always smelled like industrial cleaner no matter how many times I mopped it. Behind the counter where I worked sat a wall of cigarettes, lottery tickets, and a security monitor showing feeds from 3 cameras. 2 outside covering the pumps, 1 inside covering the store. Around 1:30 a.m., a sedan pulled up to pump 4. Older model, maybe a Camry or Accord, dirty enough that I couldn't tell the original color. A woman got out, probably in her 40s, wearing a heavy coat and moving with the careful stiffness of someone who'd been driving for too long. She prepaid for $20 of gas with cash, and while I processed the transaction, I noticed her hands were shaking. Not from cold, but from something else. Fear maybe, or exhaustion so deep it made her whole body tremble. "You okay?" I asked, trying to sound friendly rather than nosy. She nodded quickly, took her change, and hurried back outside without making eye contact. Through the window, I watched her pump gas while looking around constantly, like she expected someone to appear from the darkness. After she finished fueling, she got back in her car but didn't leave. She just sat there at the pump, engine running, staring straight ahead. I could see her lips moving like she was talking to herself or maybe praying. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Other than her car, the station was completely empty. No traffic on either highway, no movement except wind pushing trash across the parking lot. I was debating whether to go outside and check on her when another car appeared. A pickup truck, black or dark blue, approaching slowly from the south highway, pulled into the station but didn't stop at the pumps. Instead, it parked sideways across 2 spaces near the air pump, blocking one of the exits. 3 men got out. They moved with purpose, spreading out across the parking lot in a way that felt coordinated. One headed toward the woman's car at the pump. The other 2 moved toward different positions, like they were setting up a perimeter. The woman saw them and her reaction was immediate. She threw her car into drive and peeled out, tires screeching on the cold pavement. She didn't even bother unhooking the gas nozzle, just ripped it out of her tank and let it fall to the ground. The men ran back to their truck and followed her out of the lot, all 3 of them moving with that same unsettling coordination. Within seconds, both vehicles had disappeared onto the North Highway, leaving nothing but tire marks and a gas nozzle swinging on its hose. I stood behind the counter, my heart pounding, trying to process what I just witnessed. It looked like an attempted abduction, or maybe she'd been running from them and they'd caught up. Either way, it was bad, and I needed to call the police. My hand was reaching for the phone when I noticed something on the security monitor. The inside camera feed showing the store behind me had a figure in it. Someone standing in aisle 3, partially hidden behind a display of chips. I spun around. The store was empty. I could see all 3 aisles clearly, and there was no one there. But when I looked back at the monitor, the figure was still visible, standing perfectly still, facing toward the camera. I walked down aisle 3 slowly, my hand gripping a box cutter I kept under the counter for opening shipments. "Hello?" Stores closed to browsing. "If you need something, come to the counter." No response. I reached the spot where the figure had been on camera and found nothing. No one hiding, no disturbance, just rows of chips and cookies and snack cakes. When I got back to the counter and checked the monitor again, the figure had moved. Now it was in aisle 1, closer to the front of the store, still motionless, still facing the camera. The temperature in the store had dropped noticeably. I could see my breath now despite the heater running. The fluorescent lights flickered once, twice, then settled back to their normal buzzing glow. I pulled out my phone and called 911. While it rang, I kept my eyes on the monitor. The figure didn't move, but somehow it seemed closer, like the distance between us was collapsing in ways that didn't match the camera angle. The dispatcher answered and I explained about the woman who'd fled, the men who'd followed her, the location and direction they'd headed. She took down all the information and said she was dispatching units immediately. Then I mentioned the figure on my security camera, the one I couldn't see with my own eyes. There was a long pause before she asked if I was alone in the station. Yes, I said, watching the monitor as the figure took a step forward. Just one step, but definite movement. Can you safely leave the building? The dispatcher asked. I don't know. There's someone in here, but I can only see them on camera. When I look directly, there's nothing there. Another pause, longer this time. What do you mean you can only see them on camera? I mean, when I look at the store with my own eyes, it's empty. But on the security feed, there's someone standing in aisle 1. They're getting closer. I heard typing on the dispatcher's end, probably flagging this as a mental health issue rather than a legitimate emergency. Ma'am, I need you to remain calm. Officers are already en route regarding the incident in the parking lot. Can you stay on the line until they arrive? Yes, I whispered, because the figure on the monitor had moved again. Now it was at the end of aisle 1, right where the aisle opened onto the area in front of the counter. If I looked up from the monitor, I should be able to see it directly. I lifted my eyes from the screen and looked at the spot where the figure should be. Empty. Nothing but linoleum floor and the end cap display of beef jerky. Back to the monitor. The figure was there, close enough now that I could see details. Tall, wearing what looked like old-fashioned clothes. Their face obscured by shadow despite the bright store lights. They raised one hand slowly and pointed directly at the camera. Directly at me. The lights went out. All of them, inside and outside. Even the exit signs stopped glowing. The entire station plunged into absolute darkness except for the faint glow of my phone screen. I could hear someone breathing. Not me, though my own breath was coming fast and shallow. Someone else, somewhere in the store, breathing slowly and deliberately. Hello, I said, my voice barely working. The breathing moved. I heard footsteps, slow and measured, coming from aisle 1, coming toward the counter. I backed up until I hit the cigarette display behind me, my phone's flashlight swinging wildly across the dark store. The beam caught movement, a shadow shifting in the darkness, but nothing solid, nothing I could focus on. The footsteps reached the counter. I heard hands slap down on the surface, felt the whole structure shake with the impact. But when I aimed my light at the counter, there was nothing there. Then the lights came back on. All at once, like someone had thrown a switch, the fluorescent bulbs flickering to life with their normal buzzing hum. The store looked exactly as it had before, everything in its place, no signs of disturbance. I checked the security monitor. The figure was gone. All 3 camera feeds showed empty spaces, just the station sitting quiet in the night. My phone was still connected to 911. The dispatcher was asking if I was okay, her voice thin and distant. I told her yes, that the lights had gone out but were back now, that everything seemed fine. She said officers were 2 minutes away and to stay on the line until they arrived. I agreed and spent those 2 minutes watching the monitor and the store simultaneously, trying to understand what I just experienced. The police arrived and checked the entire building, inside and out. They found no signs of forced entry, no evidence anyone had been there besides me. One of them asked about my security system, and we reviewed the footage from the past hour together. On the recording, everything looked normal until the woman fled the station. Then, during the minute when my lights had gone out, the cameras had stopped recording. Just blank spots in the footage where time should have been. When the recording resumed, everything was exactly as before. The officer couldn't explain it, chalked it up to a power surge or technical glitch. They'd already sent units after the men in the truck, though no one had spotted them on either highway. The woman's car had also disappeared, like all 3 vehicles had vanished into the winter night. They offered to have someone sit with me for the rest of my shift, but I declined. Whatever had been in the store was gone now. I could feel the absence, the way the air pressure changes when a storm passes. I finished my shift without incident, went home, and slept for 12 hours. When I woke up, I called my boss and quit. Didn't give 2 weeks' notice, didn't offer an explanation beyond personal reasons. Just walked away from the easiest money I'd made in years because some things aren't worth the paycheck. I heard later from someone who still worked there that other night shift employees had reported similar experiences. Figures on the security cameras that weren't visible to the naked eye. Cold spots that appeared and disappeared without explanation. And once, during a particularly slow night, someone heard what sounded like a crowd of people talking in the store, dozens of voices overlapping, even though the cameras showed no one there. The station is still open, still hiring for night shifts at wages that seem too good for such an easy job. And maybe that's your warning right there. When something seems too easy, when the money's too good for the work required, maybe there's a reason others won't take it. Maybe there's a reason the position never stays filled for long. Story 7. The Snowmobile Trail. I grew up in northern Wisconsin, where winter meant snowmobiling the way summer meant swimming. By age 15, I could handle a machine in any conditions, and by 20, I'd ridden most of the major trails in the state. This happened when I was 26, during what should have been a routine afternoon ride. I'm Derek, now 34, and I haven't ridden a snowmobile since that day in 2018. The trails in Door County were legendary among riders, hundreds of miles of groomed paths cutting through forests and across frozen lakes. I'd ridden them dozens of times, usually with friends, but that particular Saturday my usual group couldn't make it. Solo riding wasn't ideal, but I'd done it before. I had my phone fully charged, emergency supplies strapped to the machine, and I'd filed a route plan with my wife, telling her exactly which trails I'd take and when to expect me home. All the smart precautions people who ride alone should take. The day started perfectly. Temperature around 20 degrees, fresh snow from the night before, visibility unlimited under a cloudless blue sky. I launched from the Sturgeon Bay trailhead around noon and headed north toward Ellison Bay, planning a loop that would bring me back by 5 p.m. The first hour was pure joy, that feeling of speed and control that makes snowmobiling addictive. The trail was in perfect condition, the machine ran smoothly, and I had the route entirely to myself. In summer, these paths would be crowded with hikers and bikers, but deep winter usually meant encountering maybe one other rider every 20 or 30 minutes. Around mile marker 23, I noticed someone ahead of me, another snowmobiler, riding the same direction, staying about 200 yards in front. I figured I'd catch up eventually, maybe exchange the friendly wave riders give each other, then continue at my own pace. But I didn't catch up. No matter how much I accelerated, the gap between us stayed constant. They weren't speeding up, I could tell by their consistent pace, but somehow I couldn't close the distance. After about 10 minutes of this, the other rider pulled off into a side trail, one of those unmarked paths locals use to access private property or reach good fishing spots. I kept going straight, following the main trail toward Ellison Bay. 5 minutes later, I saw them again. Same rider, same machine, back on the main trail ahead of me. Same distance, about 200 yards out. That was impossible. The side trail they'd taken didn't reconnect with the main route for at least 5 miles, and there was no way they could have gotten ahead of me that quickly. Unless there was another access point I didn't know about, but I'd ridden these trails enough to be confident in their layout. I accelerated harder, pushing my machine to the edge of what felt safe given the conditions. The rider ahead maintained their distance perfectly, never pulling away but never letting me get closer. Then they pulled off again, this time onto a path I'd never seen before. It branched left from the main trail, cutting into heavy forest at an angle that seemed too sharp for normal trail design. No markers, no signs, just 2 narrow tracks in the snow disappearing into the trees. I should have kept going. Should have stuck to the main trail and written the whole thing off as strange but not dangerous. But curiosity got me, that same impulse that makes people investigate noises in their basement at night. I turned onto the unmarked path and followed it into the forest. The canopy closed overhead almost immediately, blocking out most of the sunlight and turning everything into shades of gray and white. The trail was rougher here, not groomed like the main routes, with fallen branches occasionally blocking the way. The tracks ahead of me stayed visible, twin lines in the fresh snow that proved someone had recently passed this way. I followed them deeper into the woods, the main trail disappearing behind me as the forest grew denser. After about a mile, the tracks stopped. They didn't fade or turn off somewhere, they just ended in the middle of the trail. Like whoever had been riding had simply lifted their machine into the air and vanished. I stopped and killed my engine, suddenly aware of how quiet the forest was. No birds, no wind, no sound except my own breathing and the tick of my cooling engine. The tracks ended at a small clearing, maybe 30 feet across. The snow in the center looked disturbed, not like someone had turned around, but like something heavy had been placed there and removed. A perfect circle of compressed snow, too regular to be natural. I got off my machine to examine it, kneeling down to look at the pattern. The snow was packed hard, compressed with immense weight, and in the center I found something that made my skin crawl. Handprints. Dozens of them, pressed into the snow at various angles, all different sizes. Some looked like adult hands, others smaller like children's. All of them facing down, fingers splayed, like a crowd of people had been lying face down in the snow, pressing their hands into it. I backed away from the clearing and reached for my phone to take pictures. Before I could pull it out, I heard an engine. The sound came from deeper in the forest, from a direction where there shouldn't be any trail at all. The noise grew louder, and I realized it wasn't just one engine. Multiple snowmobiles were approaching, their engines out of sync with each other, creating a discordant mechanical symphony. I jumped back on my machine and started it, ready to leave this place immediately. But when I turned around to head back the way I'd come, the trail was gone. The path I'd followed into the clearing had vanished, replaced by unbroken forest so dense I couldn't see more than 10 feet into it. I spun around, checking every direction. The clearing was completely surrounded by trees too thick to navigate. There was no way out except to wait and see what emerged from the forest. The engine sounds grew closer, and then I saw them. 5 snowmobiles, emerging from the trees on the far side of the clearing. They formed a line, their riders all wearing identical black snowmobile suits, their faces hidden behind tinted visors. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, engines idling, none of them making any move toward me, just sitting there watching, their helmeted heads turned in my direction. I revved my engine, trying to signal that I was leaving, that they could have the clearing. None of them responded. Then, in perfect unison, They all raised their right hands and pointed at the center of the clearing, at the compressed snow with the handprints. My machine chose that moment to stall. The engine coughed once and died, leaving me sitting in silence while 5 strangers pointed at the ground. I tried to restart it. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch. I tried again, pumping the throttle, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the controls. The riders began moving forward. All 5 of them, advancing in that same synchronized way, maintaining their line as they crossed the clearing toward me. The engine caught. I didn't wait to see what they wanted, just opened the throttle and aimed for a gap in the trees that looked slightly less dense than the rest. My machine plowed through brush and low branches, scraping against tree trunks, bouncing over hidden obstacles. Behind me, I heard the other engines rev. They were following. The forest seemed to fight me, branches grabbing at my suit, roots catching my skis, the terrain rising and falling in ways that didn't feel natural. But I kept the throttle wide open, trusting speed over caution, praying I'd find the main trail before I hit something solid enough to stop me. I broke out of the trees onto a familiar groomed trail, though not the one I'd left. This was part of the route farther north, near Ellison Bay. Somehow I'd traveled miles in minutes, or the forest had moved me, or I'd been turned around so completely I'd lost all sense of direction. I looked back at the forest. 5 snowmobiles sat at the tree line, their riders still watching. As I stared, they began backing up in unison, disappearing into the trees the same way they'd emerged. I rode straight to Ellison Bay, not stopping until I reached the town and could see people and buildings and normal civilization. My wife called while I was sitting in a gas station parking lot, asking why my GPS tracker showed me miles off my planned route. I couldn't explain it. Told her I'd taken a wrong turn and gotten turned around, which was technically true. She was annoyed but not worried. Told me to be more careful and get home safe. I never filed a report about what happened. Who would I report it to? The trail I'd followed didn't exist on any map, and the clearing with the handprints would be impossible to find again. And what would I say? That I'd been chased by synchronized snowmobilers who vanished into the forest? But I asked around later, carefully, talking to other people who rode those trails regularly. Turns out I wasn't the first person to see the rider who leads you off path. Multiple people over the years had reported following someone into unmarked forest areas, only to find themselves lost or turned around. One rider told me about a clearing he'd stumbled on years ago, said it had marks in the snow like a bunch of people had been lying down. He'd gotten spooked and left, and when he tried to find it again the next day, the forest layout had changed. The path he'd taken was gone. Another rider had seen the 5 synchronized machines. She'd been smart enough not to follow them, but they'd appeared on a main trail in front of her, riding in perfect formation before disappearing at a junction. Whatever's out there in those woods, it's not new. It's been waiting for a long time, using riders to lure other riders into areas where the normal rules don't apply, where trails appear and disappear, where distance and direction become meaningless. I sold my snowmobile that spring. Some experiences teach you the limits of what you're willing to risk for recreation. I learned mine in a clearing full of handprints, watching 5 identical riders point at the ground in silence. And I learned that sometimes the person riding ahead of you, the one who seems real and solid and normal, isn't trying to lead you anywhere good. They're just bait, like a lure on a fishing line. And something in the deep forest is waiting to see what kind of catch they bring in. Story 8. The Lodge. Corporate retreats were usually boring but harmless. A weekend of team-building exercises and motivational speeches that everyone endured for the open bar afterward. I'm Amanda, 29, working in marketing for a tech company in Seattle, and in January 2019 our entire department got sent to a wellness lodge in the Cascades for mandatory winter bonding. The lodge sat 3 hours east of Seattle, accessible only by a private road that wound through increasingly remote forest. The company had rented the entire facility for the weekend, 40 employees plus a handful of facilitators who ran the workshops. The place looked nice in the photos, rustic luxury with modern amenities, exactly the kind of spot companies pick to make mandatory fun seem appealing. We arrived Friday afternoon in a convoy of company vans. The lodge was bigger than I expected, 3 stories of dark wood and huge windows, surrounded by snow-covered pines. A massive stone fireplace dominated the main room, and the accommodations looked comfortable enough for a weekend away from the city. The first evening passed normally. Awkward icebreaker activities, dinner that was better than expected, drinks around the fireplace while our VP gave a speech about synergy and innovative thinking. By 10 p.m., most people had retreated to their rooms, exhausted from the drive and the forced socializing. I shared a second-floor room with Casey from graphic design, and neither of us knew each other well enough for comfortable conversation. We went to bed early, planning to suffer through Saturday's agenda and count down the hours until we could leave Sunday morning. Around 2 a.m., I woke to voices. Lots of voices, talking and laughing somewhere below us. I assumed some of the heavier drinkers were still up, probably violating the lodge's quiet hours. But it wasn't my problem. Then I heard the music. Old music, like something from the 1940s playing on a scratchy phonograph. The kind of music you hear in movies about Prohibition-era speakeasies. Casey sat up in her bed. "You hear that?" I nodded. "Sounds like someone's having a party." We both listened for a minute, trying to figure out if we should complain to someone or just ignore it. The music grew louder, and now we could hear dancing, the sound of dozens of feet moving across wooden floors in rhythm. "That's the ballroom," Casey said. "I saw it when we checked in. It's closed for renovations." The lodge had a large ballroom on the first floor that was blocked off with plastic sheets and warning signs. We'd been told explicitly not to enter it during our stay, that construction equipment and exposed electrical wiring made it unsafe. But someone was definitely in there now. A lot of someone's based on the noise level. We got out of bed and opened our door, expecting to see other employees in the hallway, drawn by the same sounds. The corridor was empty. Every door remained closed, no lights visible under any of them. We walked to the staircase leading down to the first floor. The music was clearly coming from below us now, accompanied by laughter and conversation so loud it seemed impossible no one else was awake. The main room stood empty when we reached it, fireplace reduced to glowing embers, furniture sitting exactly as it had been when everyone went to bed. But the noise from the ballroom was overwhelming now, the music blaring, voices shouting to be heard over it. Casey and I approached the blocked-off hallway leading to the ballroom. The plastic sheets hung motionless, no breeze or movement disturbing them, but light spilled from beneath them, warm yellow light like old incandescent bulbs, and shadows moved behind the plastic, dozens of figures dancing and mingling. "Should we check what's going on?" Casey whispered. Before I could answer, the music stopped. Immediately, completely, like someone had smashed the record. The voices cut off at the same instant. We stood in the sudden silence, listening to our own breathing and the distant tick of a clock somewhere. Then, from behind the plastic sheets, we heard footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, approaching the barrier between us and the ballroom. Something pushed against the plastic from the other side. A hand, pressing the material outward, fingers splayed. Then another hand, and another, until a dozen hands were pushing against the barrier, stretching it toward us. We ran. Didn't discuss it, didn't try to investigate further, just turned and sprinted back up the stairs to our room. We locked the door and pushed a dresser in front of it, then sat on our beds staring at each other while our hearts hammered. Neither of us slept the rest of that night. We sat awake, listening, but the lodge remained silent. No music, no voices, no footsteps in the hallway. Just the normal creaks and groans of an old building settling in the cold. The next morning at breakfast, we asked other employees if they'd heard anything during the night. Everyone said no, they'd slept soundly, hadn't heard a thing. We asked one of the lodge staff about the ballroom renovations. The woman, maybe 60 years old with a tired face, stiffened when we mentioned it. "Best not to pay attention to that room," she said quietly. "Lots of history in this place. Not all of it good." She wouldn't elaborate no matter how much we pressed. Just said the lodge had been operating since the 1920s and had seen a lot of different owners over the years. That afternoon, during a particularly boring workshop about creative problem solving, I used my phone to research the lodge. No signal for calls, but I downloaded everything to my browser before we left the city. What I found made that cold feeling in my stomach worse. The lodge had been a popular resort in the 1930s and 40s, hosting big bands and wealthy Seattle families looking for winter escapes. In 1947, during a New Year's Eve party in the ballroom, a fire had broken out. The exits had been blocked by crowd crush, people panicking and trampling each other. By the time firefighters arrived, 63 people had died, most from smoke inhalation, some from being crushed, a few from burns. The lodge had closed for years afterward, been sold and renovated multiple times, each owner trying to erase the tragedy and rebrand the place. But employees never stayed long, and guests often complained about noise from the ballroom, even during periods when it sat completely empty. I showed the article to Casey during a break. Her face went pale. "We need to leave," she said. "I don't care about the company retreat. We need to get out of here." But we were 3 hours from Seattle with no car. The company vans weren't scheduled to return until Sunday morning, and no one would authorize an early departure just because we were spooked by old ghost stories. That night, we convinced 4 other employees to stay up with us, safety in numbers. We gathered in one of the larger rooms on the 3rd floor, the 6 of us taking turns keeping watch while others dozed. Around 1 a.m., the music started again. Everyone heard it this time, the unmistakable sound of a 1940s swing band playing at full volume. We opened the door and looked down the hallway toward the staircase. The lights were different. Instead of the modern fixtures, we saw old-fashioned sconces casting that same warm yellow glow I'd seen the night before. The walls looked different too, the paint color changed, the carpet pattern altered. We were looking at the lodge as it had existed 70 years ago. "Nobody move," I whispered, though I'm not sure why I felt the need for quiet. We watched as figures began ascending the stairs. Dozens of them, dressed in formal wear from the 1940s, men in suits and women in evening gowns. They moved with the strange fluidity of people having the time of their lives, laughing and talking, completely unaware of us standing frozen in the hallway. They passed by our position without acknowledging us, heading toward rooms that didn't exist anymore, opening doors to empty walls. One woman walked directly through the spot where I stood, and for a moment I felt overwhelming happiness, the kind of joy that comes from being young and alive at a party where anything seems possible. Then she was gone, continued down the hallway, and I was left with the memory of that feeling and the sick knowledge of how her night would end. The figures filled the 3rd floor, the building becoming crowded with ghosts reliving the best night of their lives, not knowing yet that it would also be their last. The music swelled. Someone shouted that it was almost midnight, and we heard popping sounds that might have been champagne corks or might have been the first sparks of the fire. Smoke began seeping up through the floorboards. Thin at first, just wisps of gray that could have been imagination. But it thickened quickly, rising around our ankles, and the temperature in the hallway climbed noticeably. The party guests didn't seem to notice the smoke. They continued their celebrations, counting down to midnight, getting ready to welcome 1948 without knowing they'd never see it. "We have to get out," Casey said, already moving toward the main staircase. But when we reached it, we found it blocked by people, ghosts or memories or whatever they were, packed so tightly on the steps that passing through them seemed impossible. The crowd was pushing down now instead of up, panic replacing celebration, everyone trying to reach the ground floor as smoke filled the building. We ran to the back staircase, the service stairs that staff used. That route was clear, and we descended as fast as we dared, the 6 of us stumbling over each other in our rush to reach the ground floor. We burst out the back entrance into the freezing night, dressed only in pajamas and bare feet, and we didn't stop moving until we were 50 yards from the building. Then we turned and looked back at the lodge. The windows on all 3 floors glowed with that yellow light, and we could see figures moving behind the glass. The ballroom windows showed the clearest picture, dozens of people pressed against the glass from the inside, their mouths open in screams we couldn't hear, hands beating against windows that wouldn't break. Then, like someone had flipped a switch, it all stopped. The yellow light vanished, replaced by normal electric lighting. The figures disappeared. The lodge sat quiet and still in the snow, looking exactly as it had when we'd arrived. We stood in the cold until our feet went numb, none of us wanting to go back inside but having no choice. When we finally re-entered through the back door, we found several other employees in the main room, awakened by the noise of us leaving. They wanted to know what was happening, why we'd run outside in the middle of the night. We tried to explain, but our story sounded insane even to our own ears. They thought we'd been drinking or were pulling some kind of prank. The lodge staff appeared, including the older woman from breakfast. She looked at us with something like pity and said that sometimes the building remembers, that on certain nights, especially cold ones in January, the past bleeds through and the party starts over again. "Best thing to do is stay in your rooms," she said. "Don't watch. Don't listen. It'll pass." We demanded to leave immediately, to have the company send vehicles to pick us up, but the manager refused. Said the roads were too dangerous at night, that we'd have to wait until morning. He offered to move us to the lodge's annex building, a newer structure about a quarter-mile away where visiting staff usually stayed. The 6 of us spent the rest of the night in the annex, none of us sleeping, just waiting for dawn. Through the windows, we watched the main lodge. Around 3 a.m., we saw flames. Not real flames, but the memory of them. Orange light filling the ballroom windows, smoke pouring from roof vents that hadn't existed since the 1940s. We watched 63 people die again, the same way they died 70 years before, trapped by circumstance and crowd panic and bad luck. We watched the past play out like a film, unable to help or intervene or change anything. By sunrise, it was over. The lodge looked normal again, no signs of fire or damage. The company vans arrived at 9 a.m. as scheduled, and we loaded into them without explanation to the other employees, most of whom had slept through everything. 3 of us quit our jobs within a month of returning to Seattle. The other 3 transferred to different departments, requested never to be sent on company retreats again. Our managers thought we'd had some kind of group breakdown, maybe too much stress and too much alcohol mixing badly. None of us tried to convince them otherwise, because how do you explain that some buildings hold onto their worst moments, replaying them over and over for anyone unlucky enough to be watching? How do you make someone understand that the past isn't really past, that it's just waiting in places where tragedy burned so hot it left permanent marks? The lodge is still operating. They still host corporate retreats and wedding receptions and family reunions. And I'm sure most people who visit have perfectly normal experiences, never seeing or hearing anything unusual. But if you ever find yourself there on a cold January night, if you hear music playing from a closed ballroom, if you see figures in old-fashioned clothes walking hallways that seem different than they should be, don't investigate. Just go to your room, lock the door, and wait for morning. Because some parties never end, and some guests never leave, and the worst thing you can do is join them. Finally, winter holds more than just cold and snow. It holds memories frozen in time, waiting for the right conditions to thaw. These stories happen to real people who learned that lesson the hard way. And if they happen to them, they can happen to anyone. Stay safe out there. And remember, when something feels wrong, when every instinct tells you to turn back, to run, to get help, listen to that voice. Because winter doesn't forgive mistakes, and some things that move in the darkness and cold aren't bound by the rules that govern the living. Thanks for listening to these 8 true scary winter horror stories. If you made it this far, hit that like button, subscribe for more terrifying tales, and leave a comment telling me which story scared you the most. Until next time, stay warm, stay alert, and never, ever ignore your instincts when winter closes in.